Hey everybody, I'm Joe. Around here we normally like to talk about monsters, but I want to do something a little bit different for a few videos. I want to talk about this. This is the Marvel Multiverse role-playing game. This is a TTRPG officially published by Marvel. It's not a licensed product by somebody else. This is Marvel doing it, and it's their foray into the RPG world and community, which is really exciting. The goal of the game is to allow players to build superheroes that would fit and work inside of the larger Marvel multiverse and be able to run superhero adventures. That's an exciting idea for an RPG, especially the idea of not just playing extant characters, but being able to build your own. I haven't seen a whole lot of stuff on the internet analyzing the rules and the gameplay mechanics, especially taking into account the 3 updates to the core rules that have come out since this playtest rulebook was released. This was released much earlier this year, and there have been 3 updates to it. And I want to talk about the game and how it works and how to be able to bring it to life at your table. The things that I think work and the things that I think don't work, so that you can pick it up and start playing it and perhaps give Marvel feedback on their website, which they are asking for, to refine the game and make it better. So today we're going to take a look at the dice rolling mechanics and how the what's called d616 system actually works in the most recent iteration of the rules. And that is as of December 2022. So here we go. There are lots of ways of building a dice rolling mechanic. The most popular system in the world is Dungeons & Dragons, which uses a d20 mechanic. Roll a 20-sided die, add a modifier, try to beat a number. And that's a very good system, and we're going to do some comparison against it. But there are other systems as well. There is Call of Cthulhu, where you roll a d100 and attempt to roll underneath a specific value that you did some point buy into. So why have different dice mechanics? It's not just to make a game confusing. It's not just to be different. I would argue that someone attempting to change a dice mechanic for no other reason than just being different than another system is going about it the wrong way. A dice system is supposed to produce a certain game flow and a certain feel of the game. And let me tell you what I'm on about here. What is the average dice roll of a d20? Well, the way you calculate this is you take all of the possible outcomes, add up the numbers 1 through 20, and then divide them by the number of sides of the dice, which is of course 20. And if you do that, the answer is not 10, it's 10.5. The average dice roll of a d6 is 3.5, the average dice roll of a d8 is 4.5, etc. That's how that math works. So if you see average dice rolls in rule books or discussed online, that's where those numbers come from. Now, average dice roll has a very specific meaning. It specifically means over time. What we mean by that is that we don't think you are more likely on a single die roll to get closer to 10 than to 1 or 20. But we do mean that if you were to record all of your dice rolls throughout a campaign of a d20, and then at the end of a campaign add them all up and average them, you would be constantly approaching 10.5. And the more you rolled, the closer to 10.5 you would continue to get. So the average dice roll implies a roll throughout time. Now that's different than the expected die roll of an individual roll, right? So if we were to make a single roll, the number 1 is just as likely as the number 20, just as likely as the number 10, right? So any individual roll is by no means more or less likely than another one. One side of the die, one face is not more likely than another, independent of what has been rolled before. So let's take a look at the way that Marvel wants to do dice rolling. They have a system that is called the d616. Now, there's a little bit of a self-serving aspect to this. The core Marvel comics take place on World 616, and so building that into their mechanics is a logical thematic choice. But this is a roll of 3 6-sided die. And what's nice about that is that everyone has six-sided dice around, right? You can raid another board game and you've got six-sided dice. A d20 is something that you have to get when you first get into RPGs. And so they wanted this game to be very accessible to the Marvel fan community as much as it is accessible to the RPG community, which sometimes has a lot of overlap and sometimes not. So what is the average die roll of a d6? And the answer is 3.5. So what's the average dice roll of 3d6? And the answer is 10.5. It's the exact same average over time. However, what's different is the expected die roll at any individual roll. And we're getting into something called standard deviation here, but the basic idea is this. The reason that an individual roll of a die with the d20 has nothing necessarily to do with the long-term average is we're just as likely to hit 1 as we are 10 as 20. But the more dice that you roll, the closer you will be to the average on any individual roll. So where an individual roll of a d20 has a 5% likelihood of being a 1, rolling 3d6 is more likely to be close to the average. And that creates a different feel at the table. So with the 616 system, anything that you do, an attack roll or an ability check, you're rolling 3d6. Always. Any roll that the game master, called the narrator, wants you to make is going to be a 3d6 roll. Always. So technically speaking, an entire game can just have 3 six-sided die at the table, though I wouldn't recommend that. And each roll is more likely to be close to the center than a single die roll of a d20, though the averages will be the same over time. Now, this roll of die means that your hero is more likely to have an average roll, in other words, more likely to be a standard success than in Dungeons and Dragons. And so the feel over time is that in D&D there is always this balancing act where you could have a natural 1 and have a real failure at any moment. With the Marvel superhero game, you are more likely to be consistent over time and allow for your character to feel heroic throughout time. These are going to feel different, and that can be a very interesting mechanic. On top of that, we take a look at abject failure. So a natural 1 is 5% of the time that you roll a d20. What is the worst possible roll in the 616 system? Now, technically, it is a 1, a 1, and a 2 for reasons we'll get into. And that is going to happen about half of 1% of the time. So abject failure is less likely. Now, the best possible roll that you can have in the 616 system is a 6, a 1, and a 6. Makes sense. And that roll is less likely than rolling 2 nat 20s. And so this enormous success is highly unlikely, though it is more likely than it sounds like, for reasons we'll get into. But you're going to have regular amounts of success. And that's before we take into account the special die. So one of the six-sided dice is going to be a visually different one, and this will be called the Marvel die. It needs to be visually different, and you need to specify at the beginning of a game which one of your dice is your Marvel die, because it's going to matter. This dice does different stuff, and it effectively is a six-sided die with 2 6s. The 6 counts as a 6 numerically, and the 1 counts as a 6 numerically. As a result, the worst roll you can have is 2 1s on your regular dice and a 2 on your Marvel dice. So your numerical range of rolls is going to be from a 4 to an 18. Now, the main purpose of this is to allow the Marvel die to have a roll on the 1. The 1 has on a die that is distributed by Marvel, it's going to have the Marvel logo on it. But of course, for anybody else, your specified Marvel die, whatever your 1 is, numerically counts as a 6. And it also does something special. So let's get into that. It used to be in the original playtest rulebook that if you rolled 3 ones, this was called a botched roll, and it's the worst roll you could have. And in this instance, the 1 didn't count as a 6, it counted as a 1. That was a little confusing. They got rid of the botched roll mechanic, and they got rid of that idea. And so now the Marvel Dice 1 always counts as a 6 numerically. So it's easier to remember, and the idea of the botched roll is also taken out of the rules. When you roll a 1 on the Marvel die, this means something extra and special happens. In the most current update of the rules, rolling an attack and having a 1 on the Marvel die does double damage and potentially knocks somebody prone. And it can have extra features to it if you have a power that indicates as such, and or if the narrator indicates it as such. And this is one of my favorite aspects of the game, and it's going to matter for our conversation. If you roll a 1 on the Marvel die, which is called a fantastic roll in the rule book, it sounds a little silly, but that's what it's called. If you have a fantastic roll, something extra and special happens. Now, if you rolled a 1 and you succeed in the roll, this is called a fantastic success. But if you roll a 1 on the Marvel die but still fail, because the other two dice are relatively small numbers, then something good still happens. And this is called, in the playtest rulebook, the yes and or no but mechanic, meaning that something is going to change on the battlefield whenever you roll a 1. Now, rolling a 1 on a 6-sided die is a little bit under 17% of the time. So these fantastic successes are going to happen regularly. You're going to get this double damage mechanic, or you're going to get this mechanic of something extra happening on the battlefield a very reasonable amount of the time. Remember, a nat 20 in D&D is only 5% of the time, but a fantastic success in this game is a little bit under 17%. So this is good in a number of ways. You get to feel heroic with cool stuff happening. Also, as the game master, as the narrator, if I see a yes and or no but, I'm going to take the opportunity to change the environment for my players so that something extra and special happens, changing the nature of things in front of them and allowing them to interact with their environment in new and different ways. One of the worst things that can happen in combat in an RPG is that a player will just run up to a bad guy and they'll just start hitting each other until one of them falls, which is not nearly as much fun. Having the yes and or no but mechanic is going to allow me to reshape the battlefield. And you better believe I'm going to give the exact same capacity to my villains, where something good might happen for them as well. So the Marvel die and a roll works like this. A narrator's going to say to do a roll for an ability check or to attack. You roll, you add a modifier just like in any other RPG, and it's compared to what's called a TN or a target number. Very, very simple stuff. Target number for ability checks, or a defense score if you're trying to attack. That's it, very, very simple. If you roll a 1 on the Marvel die, numerically you count it as a 6, you announce that you got a fantastic success, and something extra is going to happen. It might be as small as double damage, and it might be as large as something extra and cool happening in the battlefield, to be determined by your game master. And there is the possibility of rolling 2 6s on the regular die and a 1 on the Marvel die, which is called an ultimate fantastic success. Again, kind of a silly phrase. If this happens, something amazing is going to happen. And you might think that that, of course, is less likely than rolling 2 nat 20s in a row, but it's actually a little bit better than that. So we've been saying that the odds of rolling an ultimate fantastic success are very low. The odds of rolling a fantastic success are actually pretty good, a little bit under 17%. But that's before we take into account that one of the core features of the Marvel Multiverse game is a re-rolling mechanic. This is actually a very common thing in the game. And so when I give odds of certain rolls, that's only a natural roll without re-rolling mechanic. But there are 3 mechanisms in place for re-rolls. They are called edge, trouble, and karma. An edge is when you get to re-roll 1 die after making a roll because of some kind of an advantage you have. that your character is a little bit more likely than normal to succeed in what they're doing. Some powers grant edges, some traits grant edges, and sometimes your training or the circumstance or just your role play that you've done has granted an edge granted by the narrator. So some of these are baked into the mechanics that you gain as a character, and some are granted by the narrator. You make a roll, an ability check, or an attack, and if you choose to use your edge, you can re-roll one of the die. Trouble is when you are a little bit less likely to succeed in what you're doing. The way that the mechanic works, and this has been changed in one of the updates to the game, is if you have trouble with a roll, the narrator announces it, you make your roll, and you automatically re-roll whatever your highest die roll was. If there's a tie, it's chosen by the narrator, or technically by the creature that granted you trouble, but that's usually the narrator. Now, there are a number of mechanisms in the game that grant edge and trouble, and that means that you can kind of force yourself to be in a position to be more likely to gain a fantastic success or an ultimate fantastic success. And that means that you have a lot of opportunities to make big things happen in the game. And what if you are in a position where nothing that your background or the way you've positioned yourself or your powers grants an edge? Well, you can always use karma. So karma is that idea of a superhero just having a little bit of the force of fate behind them, helping them out. You get a number of karma points per day equal to your level, which is called rank. And all that karma can be used for in the current playtest rule set is to grant yourself an edge whenever you choose. That's pretty cool. And so whenever you want, you can effectively grant yourself an edge a small number of times per day. Otherwise, you have to rely on the game mechanics to have this. This gives you many opportunities to have an edge on something you are attempting to do. So having a fantastic success is going to happen more than 17% of the time. So what does this all mean? It means that there's a lot of re-rolling in the game based on edge, trouble, and karma. But all that does is allow you to re-roll a single die. If you have, and by the way, edge and trouble stack, so you can have double edge on something and re-roll 2 dice if you want to. All of this is in place to make sure that abject failure, a 2 on the Marvel die and 1s on the other dice is very rare, that you have consistent rolls and you have a lot of opportunities to have something big and cool happen. This game is designed to make your hero feel heroic. And in that sense, it is going to be a different play style and a different game at the table than things like Call of Cthulhu or Pathfinder or, of course, Dungeons and Dragons. The 616 system is actually quite simplified. It's always a roll of the exact same set of dice. You always add them up in the same way. The 1 on the Marvel die is always numerically a 6, and all you have to do is announce if the Marvel die landed on a 1. The narrator and your powers are going to indicate if you get to do any re-rolling, and that's it. So it's actually a very simplified system. It has been simplified from the original playtest material, and ideally makes your superhero come to life. So this has been a look at how the 616 dice rolling system works in Marvel Multiverse. In other videos, I'm going to explore how superpowers work. I'm going to explore my favorite superpowers. I'm going to explore how rank works. I hope that you join me for those. Thanks a lot, and may your games be awesome.